February 1942. The Allied situation in the Pacific was dire. Following the initial Japanese successes at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Malaya, the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, advanced relentlessly toward the resource-rich Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia. Control of the islands, which contained vital oil and rubber reserves, was an existential strategic goal for the Japanese war machine. Compelling evidence. To halt this thrust, the Allies formed the desperate multinational naval command, ABDACOM, American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, placing the small fragmented fleet under the command of Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman. Doorman's mission was uncompromising: intercept and destroy the massive Japanese invasion convoy heading toward Java, the strategic heart of the East Indies. Failure meant the total collapse of the Allied presence in the region. Insightful expert, quote, "The ABDA fleet was a logistical and operational nightmare from the start. Comprising 14 cruisers and destroyers from 4 different navies, the ships lacked common doctrine, standardized signals, or adequate reconnaissance aircraft." Doorman later acknowledged his fleet was the thin blue line against a technologically superior, fully integrated enemy force. Vivid example: communication within the battle line was agonizingly slow. Orders often had to be relayed using manual signal lamps or flag hoists, as incompatible radio frequencies in the language barrier, Dutch, English, American, precluded rapid, complex maneuvers, a fatal liability in fast-moving naval air warfare. The rich explanation for the Allied weakness is the failure of peacetime planning to anticipate coalition warfare. The necessity of merging disparate units under enemy pressure meant the fleet was strategically handicapped from the outset, relying on desperate courage rather than unified strategic action. The fate of Southeast Asia and the Allied war effort's fuel supply lay squarely on the shoulders of this mismatched force, which faced an enemy that was not only superior in numbers but also utterly focused and coordinated. The battle's inevitable result was foreshadowed by a catastrophic intelligence failure on the Allied side, allowing the Japanese to dictate the terms of engagement from outside the effective range of the ABDA fleet. Compelling evidence. The Japanese tactical force, commanded by Rear Admiral Takeo Takagi, included 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 14 destroyers, a superior force that operated with continuous, near-perfect intelligence throughout the engagement. The Japanese utilized superior scouting aircraft, launched from land bases in Borneo, and aircraft carriers positioned further north. These planes provided continuous, real-time location and course updates on the ABDA fleet, confirming the decisive advantage of air reconnaissance. Insightful expert, quote, "The ABDA fleet, lacking effective radar and dedicated long-range scouting, was operating virtually blind. This intelligence gap meant Admiral Doorman was constantly reacting to the enemy's positioning, never able to anticipate the main thrust or initiate a surprise attack." Vivid example. When the engagement began, the Japanese heavy cruisers deliberately opened fire at extreme range, utilizing superior optical rangefinders and fire control systems that allowed them to accurately strike the ABDA ships from beyond the effective range of many of the Allied ships. Guns. A crippling tactical disadvantage. The rich explanation for the range disparity is the Japanese pre-war emphasis on long-range gunnery and optical equipment superiority, allowing them to dictate the terms of engagement and keep the more heavily armored targets safe from the Allied return fire. The Allied plan was neutralized before the guns were even truly effective. The statistical reality was a fight where the Allies were already strategically compromised by a massive intelligence failure, facing a coordinated enemy that saw them clearly while they struggled to locate the source of the punishing salvos. The initial daylight engagement confirmed the Allies' tactical inferiority, with the Japanese introducing a stealthy, devastating weapon that instantly fractured the fragile multinational formation. Compelling evidence. The ABD fleet suffered rapid, devastating losses due to a combination of heavy Japanese shell fire and the use of the deadly Type 93 long-lance torpedo. This weapon, oxygen-fueled, was capable of immense speed, range over 20 miles, and carried a massive warhead, capabilities largely unknown to the Allies. The crucial heavy cruiser, HMS Exeter, a veteran of the Battle of the River Plate, suffered an early crippling hit that destroyed several boiler rooms and drastically reduced her speed to just her 15 knots. This loss fractured the Allied formation. Insightful expert, quote, "The loss of the Exeter's speed was a tactical disaster, as the remaining ships were forced to disrupt their own battle line to screen the crippled cruiser, making Doorman's entire formation vulnerable to the highly coordinated Japanese fire." Vivid example. The Dutch destroyer, Scortenaire, MSS Cortenaire, was suddenly struck by a long-lance torpedo, likely launched from a cruiser positioned far outside the visual range, and exploded, sinking in a matter of minutes. This terrifying, rapid destruction confirmed the overwhelming power of the enemy's armament. The rich explanation for the rapid losses is the lack of common doctrine. The multinational crews had never trained together for complex maneuvers or damage control. When the battle line fractured, the communication delays and lack of coordinated fire support turned the coalition's diversity into a fatal liability. The battle was less a coordinated naval engagement and more a series of desperate, isolated defensive actions, with the Allied ships struggling to maintain any effective formation cohesion under sustained, crippling fire. Despite the fragmentation of his command and the crushing losses, Admiral Dorman adhered rigidly to his mission objective, making a final, profound command decision that led to the fleet's complete annihilation. Compelling evidence. By nightfall, Dorman's operational command was reduced to one heavy cruiser, USS Houston, two Dutch light cruisers, HNLMS De Ruyter and HNLMS Java, and a handful of remaining destroyers. The enemy convoy, the key strategic objective, remained untouched. Facing this existential reality, Dorman issued his famous fatal order: "All ships follow me. I am attacking." His decision was a commitment to fulfilling the mission at the cost of his own life and the destruction of the remaining fleet. Insightful expert, quote, "Dorman's relentless focus on reaching the convoy forced his exhausted, damaged crews to continue the pursuit through the night, entering a phase of battle where Japanese night-fighting doctrine excelled due to superior optics, coordinated flares, and long-range torpedoes." Vivid example. The Japanese deliberately waited for the darkness, utilizing their advanced equipment to locate and intercept Dorman's final thrust. They launched a devastating salvo of long-lance torpedoes at the Dutch cruisers that were at the heart of the ABDACOM line. The rich explanation for the night loss is the successful Japanese integration of reconnaissance with surface fleet positioning. They were able to use their heavy cruisers as ambushing platforms, guided to the ABDA ships by their advanced long-range optical and possibly early radar equipment. The Dutch flagship HNLMS De Ruyter and the cruiser HNLMS Java were struck by these unseen torpedoes, exploding and sinking almost instantly, taking Admiral Dorman down with his command and extinguishing the central leadership of the entire Allied operation. The death of Admiral Dorman and the sinking of his flagship signaled the total, final strategic collapse of the Allied defense of Java. The few surviving ships were ordered to scatter, but the Japanese net was closing fast, securing the ultimate strategic prize. Compelling evidence. The remaining ships, primarily the American heavy cruiser USS Houston and the Australian light cruiser HMAS Perth, were ordered to break contact and attempt to escape through the Sunda Strait, the narrow passage between Java and Sumatra. In a final, tragic irony, they ran directly into a separate, massive Japanese invasion convoy and its covering force in the Battle of Sunda Strait, February 28th, confirming the overwhelming, layered Japanese dominance of the sea lanes. Insightful expert, quote, "In the chaos of the final night engagement, both the Houston and Perth were overwhelmed by concentrated Japanese gunfire and torpedoes from an immense force that included battleships and more heavy cruisers, marking the annihilation of the last major Allied surface units." Vivid example. The Allied loss was profound. 5 cruisers, second F-6 destroyers were sunk in total across the engagements, and over 2,300 Allied personnel were killed. The Japanese had secured control of the Java Sea at a minimal cost in ships and resources. The rich explanation for the annihilation is the Japanese goal of total domination. They committed overwhelming, layered forces to protect the invasion convoys, ensuring that any ship breaking through the first screen would be intercepted by a second, superior force. The statistical reality was irreversible. The Japanese invasion convoys landed unopposed, quickly seizing the islands and the vast oil and rubber resources necessary to sustain their offensive for the next 2 years. The complete annihilation of the ABDA fleet provided the Japanese war machine with the critical, uninhibited resources necessary to continue their relentless expansion across the Pacific. Compelling evidence. With the sea lanes definitively secured by the victory, the Japanese invasion convoys landed unopposed on Java, quickly seizing the islands. The Japanese gained total control of the oil fields, rubber plantations, and tin mines of the Dutch East Indies, resources that were essential to fuel their ongoing offensive campaigns and sustain their war effort for the next 2 years. This was the core strategic prize of the battle. Insightful expert, quote, The Battle of the Java Sea confirmed the temporary but definitive strategic collapse of the Allied presence in Southeast Asia. The Japanese were free to consolidate their control over the southern resource area, a key economic war objective that guaranteed the continuation of their offensive posture. Vivid example: the total loss of the Allied fleet ensured that the evacuation of remaining Allied ground troops from Java was nearly impossible, leading to the capture and internment of tens of thousands of Dutch, British, and Australian personnel. A massive loss of Allied manpower. The rich explanation for the strategic finality is that the defeat was not just a naval loss, but an economic catastrophe for the Allies, providing Japan with the material means to continue the war. The battle was a key component of a larger, coordinated strategic plan to establish a vast, self-sufficient defensive perimeter. The Battle of the Java Sea was the tragic conclusion of the Allied defensive campaign in the region, a decisive moment where Japanese strategic necessity was fulfilled through overwhelming naval superiority. The destruction of the Allied fleet immediately enabled the Japanese to secure their flank and pivot their forces towards subsequent decisive invasions throughout the archipelago, confirming their unchallengeable control. Compelling evidence. Following the sinking of the last ABD ships, the Japanese quickly focused on eliminating the remaining Allied air forces and ground troops on Java and the surrounding islands. The sea was entirely Japanese-controlled, allowing them to rapidly move troop transports, supply convoys, and overwhelming air cover to solidify their hold on the islands without fear of naval interference. Insightful expert quote: "The speed of the conquest meant the Japanese could rapidly redeploy their naval assets, including the heavy cruisers and destroyers involved in the Battle of the Java Sea, to participate in future decisive operations, such as the invasion of New Guinea and later, the Battle of the Coral Sea." Vivid example. The Japanese established air superiority over the entire region, quickly neutralizing the few remaining Allied airfields and confirming the absolute vulnerability of any isolated Allied resistance. The rich explanation for the rapid consolidation is the synergistic effect of the victory. The naval victory guaranteed air superiority and ground dominance, turning the entire defense of the East Indies into a foregone conclusion. The Allies simply had no means of reinforcement or resupply. The decisive nature of the naval victory ensured the rapid, total collapse of the Allied ground defense, leaving the Japanese strategically secure in their new territorial gains. The battle remains a crucial case study in the failure of multinational military coordination and the profound difficulties of fighting a coalition war without a common tactical doctrine. Compelling evidence. The ABDACOM experiment was a logistical and operational failure rooted in a lack of standardization across four navies. The fragmentation of command, language barriers, and differing operational doctrines meant that complex maneuvering was nearly impossible, rendering the fleet tactically inferior to the highly trained, monolithic Japanese Navy. Insightful expert quote: "The failure confirmed the high cost of non-standardized technology. The varying communication systems, radio incompatibility, different gunnery standards, and disparate ship designs prevented the ABDA fleet from operating as a single, cohesive unit capable of maximizing its collective firepower." Vivid example. The American ships fought with American doctrine, the Dutch with theirs, and the British with theirs, leading to confusion when simple maneuvering orders needed rapid execution under enemy fire, causing gaps and exposures in the line that the Japanese ruthlessly exploited. The rich explanation for the communication breakdown is that the fleet had not had adequate time to train together or develop a unified doctrine, a luxury the rapidly advancing enemy did not afford them. The necessity of coalition was a strategic imperative, but the operational realities were disastrous. The statistical reality of the defeat highlighted that military success is based on seamless coordination, not just the sum of individual ships, proving that a fragmented fleet is easily defeated by a unified one. The Japanese victory was heavily reliant on the operational effectiveness of their primary offensive weapon, the Type 93 Long-Lance torpedo, which achieved a terrifying level of destruction and strategic paralysis. Compelling evidence. The Long-Lance torpedo, propelled by oxygen rather than compressed air, had a remarkable range of over 20 miles and a large warhead. This was a technological surprise that the Allies were unprepared for. The ability of the Japanese cruisers to launch these torpedoes from outside the effective range of the Allied ships created a Nile effect that forced the ABDA fleet to break formation and maneuver defensively, even when no enemy ships were visible. Insightful expert quote: The sudden, catastrophic sinking of the HNLMS Cortenair and the Dutch cruisers in the night engagement, all attributed to this invisible, long-range weapon, severely degraded the morale of the Allied crews who could not comprehend the source of the lethal strikes. Vivid example. The long-lance torpedo allowed the Japanese to dominate the night battles, as they could use flares and superior optics to position their ships for effective long-range launches, while the Allied ships were forced into chaotic defensive maneuvers. The rich explanation for the technological disparity is the Japanese pre-war commitment to torpedo technology and doctrine. Their willingness to develop and perfect a high-risk, high-reward weapon proved decisive against an enemy who believed they understood the conventional limits of torpedo warfare. The technological gap imposed by the long-lance torpedo made the ABDA defense strategically hopeless, turning the engagement into an exercise in self-destruction. The Battle of the Java Sea remains a tragic example of an unwinnable battle, where the courage of the commanders and crews was ultimately overwhelmed by the failure of the Allied High Command to commit sufficient, coordinated resources. Compelling evidence. The defeat was fundamentally a strategic failure long before Admiral Dorman engaged the enemy. The Allied High Command failed to dedicate adequate carrier air power or sufficient modern cruisers and destroyers to the defense of the region, forcing a cobbled-together surface fleet to face overwhelming odds. Admiral Dorman's final command decision to attack, knowing he was outgunned, outscouted, and low on fuel, was an act of profound personal and professional desperation, justified only by the existential strategic importance of the convoy. Insightful expert, quote, "The ultimate statistical reality of the loss, 5 cruisers and 6 destroyers sunk for minimal Japanese loss, affirmed the overwhelming nature of the Japanese victory and the strategic inevitability of the East Indies' fall." Vivid example. The fate of the USS Houston and HMAS Perth in the Sunda Strait, where they were annihilated by a second, equally overwhelming force, symbolized the layered, unchallengeable nature of the Japanese invasion plan. The rich explanation for the high cost is that the battle was a calculated sacrifice. Dorman was ordered to fight a battle of annihilation to gain time, but the Japanese efficiency and superiority meant the time gained was negligible, transforming the heroic sacrifice into a tragic strategic footnote. The Battle of the Java Sea, though fought with immense bravery, was the decisive and devastating confirmation of Japan's early war naval supremacy, a necessary but futile sacrifice of men and materiel. The initial retreat of the Allied destroyers confirmed the logistical constraints and operational incoherence that crippled the ABDA fleet's ability to sustain the engagement past the initial daylight phase. Compelling evidence. After the HNLMS Cortenair was sunk and the HMS Exeter was crippled, the American and British destroyers were forced to withdraw toward Java to refuel, having expended a significant portion of their limited torpedo and shell stocks. This forced withdrawal severely reduced Admiral Dorman's anti-submarine ASW and destroyer screening capacity, leaving his remaining cruisers dangerously exposed to submarine attack and further Japanese surface action in the evening and night engagements. Insightful expert, quote, "The decision by the destroyers to leave the battle was a logistical necessity, not a failure of morale. However, it exposed the core strategic flaw of the entire ABDACOM setup, the lack of adequate local fuel and supply depots to support sustained operations against a coordinated enemy." Vivid example. The American destroyers, after dropping off survivors, faced a desperate race against time to refuel and return to the fray, a mission complicated by the lack of secure, prepared rear bases in the face of the rapidly advancing Japanese forces. The rich explanation for the fleet's rapid depletion is the Japanese success in striking first and hard. By crippling the Exeter, they maximized the damage to the entire ABDA battle plan, forcing support ships out of the line and disrupting the entire tactical structure. The logistical pressure on the smaller, faster ships confirmed the immediate statistical reality of the Japanese strategic control, as the ABDA ships were fighting the fuel gauges as much as the enemy. The chaotic withdrawal of the crippled HMS Exeter from the battle zone exposed the immense strategic gamble the Allies had taken in committing the valuable heavy cruiser to such an unbalanced engagement. Compelling evidence. Following the crippling 11-inch shell hit, the HMS Exeter was detached from the main ABDA force and was escorted by a handful of destroyers, steaming slowly towards Surabaya for repairs. The mere presence of the damaged cruiser continued to draw Japanese attention. On March 1, 1942, the Exeter and its 2 escorting destroyers were intercepted by a powerful Japanese heavy cruiser force. Insightful expert, quote, "The engagement became a tragic final mop-up. The damaged Exeter, unable to maneuver or maintain speed, was overwhelmed by concentrated gunfire and torpedoes and was sunk with heavy loss of life, confirming the Japanese objective of total annihilation of the enemy surface fleet. Vivid example. The sinking of the Exeter, the ship that had famously survived the Battle of the River Plate, symbolized the tragic difference between the early war Allied victories of 1939 and the reality of the coordinated, overwhelming Japanese power of 1942. The rich explanation for the Exeter's fate is the lack of air cover. Once air superiority was lost to the Japanese, the damaged surface ship became an easy, vulnerable target for focused, systematic destruction, a common lesson of the Pacific War. The elimination of the heavy cruiser confirmed the high cost of the initial confrontation and served as a clear signal that the Japanese would tolerate no escapees from the Java Sea. The fate of the USS Houston, having fought through the initial battle and the chaos of the Sunda Strait, stands as a tragic monument to the unwavering courage of the crews who endured the unwinnable fight. Compelling evidence. The USS Houston, a heavy cruiser, fought bravely through the entire engagement, having already lost a crucial aft turret to Japanese air attack weeks before the battle. Following the destruction of Admiral Dorman's flagship, the Houston and HMAS Perth made the fateful decision to attempt a night escape through the Sunda Strait, believing the route was clear of the main Japanese invasion force. Insightful expert, quote, "In the subsequent Battle of Sunda Strait, February 28th, the two Allied cruisers ran directly into the Western invasion convoy and its overwhelming escort. The Houston and Perth fought a fierce, close-range engagement against two Japanese heavy cruisers, two light cruisers, and numerous destroyers." Vivid example. The Houston fought to the bitter end, expending all of its ammunition before being sunk by concentrated gunfire and multiple torpedo hits. Her final act was to engage a vastly superior enemy, fulfilling the duty of the Allied fleet until the last shell was fired. The rich explanation for the high casualties and loss of the Houston is the layered, strategic defense of the Japanese convoy. The Japanese knew the Allies would attempt to escape through the straits and had committed overwhelming force to guarantee the safety of the transports and the annihilation of any remaining enemy ships. The USS Houston was lost, but her fierce final stand became a powerful symbol of defiance against overwhelming material odds, a testament to the courage of the American crews. The immense cost in human lives confirmed the strategic finality of the defeat, leaving a lasting legacy of captured personnel and immense human tragedy across the East Indies. Compelling evidence. The total Allied loss across the engagements was catastrophic. Over 2,300 Allied personnel were killed. The crews of the 5 sunken cruisers and 6 sunken destroyers faced the grim reality of the frigid open sea and the ruthless efficiency of the victorious Japanese forces. The immediate consequence was the capture and internment of thousands of Allied sailors and airmen, many of whom faced brutal conditions in Japanese prisoner-of-war camps for the remainder of the war, a high human cost that extended far beyond the immediate battle. Insightful expert, quote, "The loss of life was compounded by the fact that the battle was fought in the early, desperate days of the war, where Allied search and rescue capabilities were minimal, greatly reducing the statistical reality of survival for those who abandoned ship." Vivid example. The fate of the survivors, including those from the Houston and Perth, who were captured, confirmed the shift from naval combat to the brutal reality of the POW experience under the Empire of Japan, adding a profound layer of human suffering to the military defeat. The rich explanation for the high human cost is the combination of the long-range, catastrophic destruction of the Japanese torpedoes and the failure of Allied forces to control the surrounding sea and air, leaving the wounded and survivors completely exposed to the enemy and the elements. The Battle of the Java Sea was not merely a loss of materiel. It was a devastating loss of irreplaceable human capital, confirming the early tragic cost of the war in the Pacific. The complete annihilation of the ABDA surface fleet immediately opened the door for the Japanese to consolidate their control, triggering a rapid and total strategic collapse across the entire region. Compelling evidence. The Japanese invasion convoys landed unopposed within days of the battle's conclusion, seizing Java and the surrounding islands with overwhelming speed. The strategic prize, the vast oil, rubber, and tints reserves, was secured, fueling the Japanese war machine and allowing them to aggressively expand their defensive perimeter to its maximum extent. Insightful expert, quote, "The defeat confirmed the end of the Allied presence in the Dutch East Indies and meant the Japanese could rapidly redeploy their powerful naval assets, including the heavy cruisers and battleships, to new theaters of war such as the invasion of New Guinea and later, operations in the Coral Sea. Vivid example: the total loss of naval and air superiority guaranteed the swift fall of Allied ground forces. Lacking resupply or reinforcement, the Dutch, British, and Australian garrisons were forced into rapid surrender, confirming the strategic role of sea control in the Pacific conflict. The rich explanation for the strategic finality is that the Japanese invasion was a meticulously planned, integrated operation. The naval victory was a prerequisite for the land victory, ensuring that the entire campaign achieved its objective with devastating efficiency and minimal Japanese loss. The Battle of the Java Sea, though a desperate fight, was the decisive conclusion of the Allied defense, marking the high water mark of Japanese expansion in Southeast Asia. The Japanese victory was heavily reliant on the operational effectiveness of their innovative and strategically surprising weaponry, particularly the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, which achieved a terrifying level of destruction and strategic paralysis. Compelling evidence: the Long Lance torpedo, propelled by pure oxygen, boasted a maximum range exceeding 20 miles and a powerful warhead. This was a technological surprise the Allies were completely unprepared for, as their own torpedoes were significantly slower, shorter ranged, and less reliable. The ability of the Japanese cruisers to launch these torpedoes from outside the effective range of Allied guns created an area denial effect that forced the ABDA fleet to constantly break formation and maneuver defensively, even when no enemy ships were visible. Insightful expert quote: "The sudden catastrophic sinking of the Dutch cruisers in the night engagement, directly attributable to this invisible long-range weapon, severely degraded the morale of the Allied crews, who could not comprehend the source of the lethal strikes." Vivid example: the Long Lance allowed the Japanese to dominate the crucial night battles, as they could use flares and superior optics to position their ships for effective long-range launches, while the fragmented Allied ships were forced into chaotic, self-defeating defensive maneuvers. The rich explanation for the technological disparity is the Japanese pre-war commitment to torpedo technology and doctrine. Their willingness to perfect a high-risk, high-reward weapon proved decisive against an enemy who assumed the conventional limitations of torpedo warfare still applied. The technological gap imposed by the Long Lance torpedo made the ABDA defense strategically hopeless, turning the engagement into an exercise in self-preservation that was ultimately futile. The complete lack of effective Allied air cover during the entire operation magnified the Japanese naval advantage, confirming that sea power could not be maintained without command of the air. Compelling evidence: the Japanese forces operated with continuous land-based air reconnaissance and protection from nearby bases they had recently captured. In contrast, the few remaining Allied aircraft in Java were quickly overwhelmed and destroyed by superior Japanese fighters and bombers. This loss of air superiority meant the ABDA fleet had no early warning of Japanese movements and was constantly vulnerable to harassment and reconnaissance, which directly fed crucial data to the Japanese surface fleet. Insightful expert quote: "The absence of air cover meant that Allied ships could not execute crucial tasks like scouting, spotting for long-range gunnery, or providing anti-submarine and anti-torpedo defense. Admiral Dorman was fighting effectively blind, unable to leverage any high-altitude perspective." Vivid example: the damaged heavy cruiser HMS Exeter was ultimately sunk in a later mop-up operation after being systematically pursued and destroyed by overwhelming Japanese surface forces, a fate that would have been unlikely had she been under continuous Allied air protection. The rich explanation for the air failure is the Allied High Command's inability to commit adequate carrier air power or sufficient land-based fighters to the defense of the East Indies, prioritizing other theaters and allowing the Japanese to achieve total air dominance in the region as a prerequisite for their invasion. Air superiority is indispensable. In modern naval warfare, the loss of air superiority renders a surface fleet critically vulnerable to both reconnaissance and systematic destruction. The ABDA fleet fought a three-dimensional battle without the third dimension. The tragic fate of the ABDACOM commanders and ships that survived the initial battle highlighted the ruthless efficiency of the Japanese mop-up operations across the surrounding straits and sea lanes. Compelling evidence: the surviving ships, including the heavy cruiser USS Houston and the light cruiser HMAS Perth, were sunk days later in the Battle of Sunda Strait after running directly into a separate, massive Japanese invasion force. The Exeter and its two escorting destroyers were intercepted and sunk on March 1st. In the space of 72 hours, the entire Allied surface fleet in the region was systematically annihilated by layered Japanese forces. Insightful expert quote, "The high efficiency of the mop-up was the result of a coordinated, layered Japanese defensive and offensive strategy. They committed overwhelming force to secure the invasion convoys and ensured that every possible escape route for the Allied ships was guarded by superior firepower." Vivid example. The sinking of the USS Houston, which fought until it was out of ammunition, confirmed the Japanese policy of total annihilation, leaving no chance for the enemy to regroup or escape to fight another day. The rich explanation for the total loss is the failure of the Allied high command to coordinate the retreat. Lacking intelligence, the surviving ships sailed directly into the strongest points of the Japanese layered defensive structure, confirming the enemy's complete control of the region. Annihilation is strategic. The efficient and systematic destruction of an enemy's remaining forces following a major victory ensures the complete success of the invasion and prevents future counterattacks. The Japanese allowed no escape. The Battle of the Java Sea serves as a permanent, crucial case study in the immense strategic risks and failures inherent in early war coalition warfare under duress. Compelling evidence. The core failure of the ABDACOM fleet was its organizational incoherence. Communication was hampered by 4 different languages: Dutch, English, American, and Australian, and incompatible radio equipment, preventing the rapid, complex tactical maneuvering necessary for success. The fragmentation of command authority meant that tactical decisions were often slow and lacked the unity of purpose exhibited by the monolithic, highly disciplined Japanese Navy, which maximized its material advantage. Insightful expert quote, "Naval analysts cite the battle as a textbook example of how lack of standardized doctrine leads to disaster. When the battle line fractured under fire, the ABDACOM ships could not effectively support each other, turning the coalition's diversity into a fatal tactical liability." Vivid example. Admiral Dorman's desperate attempts to issue new battle orders via flag signals confirmed the failure of technological interoperability, forcing the fleet to rely on outdated, slow methods in a fast-paced modern naval engagement. The rich explanation for the failure of coordination is the lack of time. The necessity of merging disparate units under enemy pressure meant the fleet was fighting its own internal disarray as fiercely as it fought the Japanese, a luxury the rapidly advancing enemy did not afford them. Coherence is non-negotiable. Military success, particularly in naval operations, requires seamless coordination and unified doctrine. A fragmented coalition is structurally compromised before the battle even begins. The tragedy of the Battle of the Java Sea remains a profound symbol of the strategic brilliance of the Japanese early war planning and the irreversible cost of Allied strategic unpreparedness in the Pacific. Compelling evidence. The ultimate strategic prize. The vast oil and raw material reserves of the Dutch East Indies was secured, fueling the Japanese war machine and allowing them to expand their offensive perimeter to its maximum extent. The annihilation of the Allied fleet ensured that the subsequent war effort to retake the islands would be immensely costly, confirming the long-term strategic consequence of the early defeat. Insightful expert, quote, "Admiral Dorman's final, desperate command, 'All ships follow me, I am attacking,' remains a poignant symbol of heroic sacrifice in the face of inevitable defeat. Yet it underscores the tragic reality that courage alone could not overcome overwhelming material and technological superiority." Vivid example. The long-term loss of over 2,300 Allied personnel, many of whom suffered years in brutal POW camps, extended the human cost of the battle far beyond the initial naval sinking, leaving a grim legacy of suffering. The rich explanation for the battle's strategic finality is that it was a decisive conclusion. It permanently established Japanese naval control over the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean approaches, defining the early, tragic parameters of the Pacific War. The Battle of the Java Sea was the high-water mark of Japanese expansion, a devastating and strategically final victory that cost the Allies irreplaceable ships, resources, and men. The immense strategic victory at the Java Sea gave the Japanese High Command the confidence and material resources to immediately initiate their next ambitious strategic objectives across the Pacific. Compelling evidence. The swift, total defeat of the ABDACOM fleet provided the Japanese with unchallenged sea control over the entire southern resource area and secured the vast oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. This guaranteed fuel and raw materials for the Japanese war machine, enabling them to aggressively expand their defensive perimeter further east, including subsequent invasions into New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Insightful expert, quote, "The annihilation of the Allied fleet freed up the powerful Japanese heavy cruiser and destroyer forces involved in the battle to be immediately redeployed for the decisive operations of the spring of 1942, including the major Japanese thrust that led to the Battle of the Coral Sea. Vivid example. The quick consolidation meant the Japanese could accelerate the construction of critical air bases in their newly acquired territories, tightening the net around Australia and hindering the planned Allied counteroffensive routes. The rich explanation for the subsequent Japanese success is the principle of synergy. The naval victory guaranteed air superiority and ground dominance, allowing Japan to achieve all strategic objectives in the region with minimal delay and maximum efficiency. The Battle of the Java Sea was the critical, successful operational step that ensured Japan reached its peak territorial expansion. The battle served as a harsh, early war laboratory that exposed critical failures in Allied naval technology, particularly in gunnery and torpedo performance when compared to their Japanese counterparts. Compelling evidence. The Japanese heavy cruisers demonstrated decisive superiority in long-range gunnery and fire control, often firing accurately from beyond the effective range of many of the Allied ships. Furthermore, the Allied half-torpedo technology proved tragically inferior. The American Mark 14 torpedoes were notoriously unreliable, suffering from depth control and detonator failures, a contrast to the devastating effectiveness of the Japanese long lance-chenyes torpedo. Insightful expert, quote, "The failure of American torpedoes meant that the few successful Allied attacks that did manage to strike a target often failed to detonate, confirming a critical technological weakness that persisted for another year of the war." Vivid example. The overwhelming destruction of the Dutch cruisers by the long-lance torpedo, which possessed superior range, speed, and warhead size, permanently validated the Japanese pre-war focus on high-performance torpedo doctrine. The rich explanation for the technological gap is the complacency within the U.S. Navy testing bureaus. This systemic failure meant that the men of the ABDA fleet were forced to fight not only the enemy but also their own faulty equipment, a tragic technological betrayal. The technological disparity was a core component of the defeat, confirming that inadequate preparation can be as fatal as poor tactics. The fate of the ship's crews confirmed the high human cost of the defeat, setting a grim precedent for the treatment and survival rates of Allied sailors captured by the Japanese. Compelling evidence. The total Allied loss of over 2,300 personnel included men from 5 different nations. The survivors who made it ashore or were rescued by Japanese vessels faced immediate capture and internment. The lack of coordinated Allied search and rescue, SAR capabilities in the region due to the loss of air and sea control, greatly reduced the statistical reality of survival for those who abandoned ship, compounding the tragedy. Insightful expert, quote, "The fate of the captured sailors, many of whom were used as forced labor on projects like the Burma Railway, confirmed the brutal reality of the Japanese prisoner of war system." Vivid example. The sheer speed of the Japanese advance and the systematic destruction of the ABDA fleet meant that no escapees were permitted. The Japanese policy ensured that the Allied manpower loss was permanent, confirming the ruthlessness of their strategic objectives. The rich explanation for the high human cost is the strategic isolation of the battlefield. The ABDA fleet was an expeditionary force with no secure rear bases or rapid reinforcement capabilities, leaving the survivors entirely at the mercy of the enemy and the elements. The Battle of the Java Sea was not only a military defeat but a devastating human tragedy, with a high percentage of survivors facing years of brutal captivity. The tragic final stand of Admiral Karel Doorman remains a powerful, though sobering, symbol of personal honor and moral adherence to duty in the face of strategic inevitability. Compelling evidence. Admiral Doorman's final command decision to press the attack, despite overwhelming losses and logistical constraints, culminating in his death aboard the HNLMS de Ruyter, demonstrated an unwavering commitment to his mission. His final signal, "All ships follow me, I am attacking," is cited as a profound act of personal bravery, but it underscores the rigid strategic imperative placed upon him by the Allied High Command to prevent the convoy landing at any cost. Insightful expert, quote, "The Dutch admiral's decision contrasted with the more pragmatic approach of saving materiel. His choice to sacrifice the remainder of the fleet was rooted in the Dutch East Indies' existential necessity to deny Japan the oil, a strategic goal that outweighed the value of the ships themselves." Vivid example. Dorman's decision, though resulting in the total loss of the fleet, secured a narrative of heroic struggle against insurmountable odds that was crucial for Allied morale and propaganda in the subsequent grim months of 1942. The rich explanation for the personal tragedy is that the burden of the entire region's defense was placed on a single flawed naval coalition. Dorman was strategically doomed, but his final act ensured that the fight was waged until the last commander fell. The admiral's final choice was a testament to personal courage, but it could not redeem the failure of strategic planning. The enduring legacy of the Battle of the Java Sea is its definitive status as a case study in early war defeat, highlighting the disastrous consequences of strategic unpreparedness and fragmented coalition warfare. Compelling evidence. The total annihilation of the ABDA fleet confirmed the strategic consequences of underestimating Japanese capabilities and the irreversible damage caused by technological and doctrinal inferiority. The battle served as a harsh, immediate lesson for the Allies. Victory would require total technological parity, unified command structures, and the absolute prioritization of air superiority in all naval operations. Insightful expert, quote, "The defeat accelerated the Allied focus on carrier air power and radar technology, pushing the U.S. Navy to rapidly correct the technological and logistical failures exposed by the early war losses." Vivid example. The sinking of the entire ABD fleet eliminated the final naval threat to the southern resource area, providing the Japanese with a strategic buffer that would take 2 years and immense resources to finally breach. The rich explanation for the battle's strategic finality is that it was the decisive end of the Allied defensive phase in Southeast Asia. The efficiency of the Japanese victory ensured their control over the region until late 1944, defining the entire course of the early to mid-Pacific War. The Battle of the Java Sea remains a powerful, tragic reminder of the immense cost of fighting a modern, total war without unified doctrine and technological parity.